Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap is an adventure platformer for the Sega Master System. It's a genre rarity in the vast console library and bears many similarities to games like Adventure Island 4, Metroid, or Legacy of the Wizard, where gated exploration is the central mechanic. Like the worlds in those quests, Monsterland is interconnected with new areas becoming reachable as other skills and tools are gathered. I find myself completely drawn to games of this style, and Wonder Boy 3 did not disappoint. The game begins with a rare opportunity to play out the events that set everything into motion. You take up the role of Wonder Boy, a young, bright-eyed warrior that stumbles into a cruel twist of fate after facing off with a huge mechanical dragon. Even though you end up winning the battle, your fallen rival casts a curse on you and changes your physical form into a lizard man. The only way to get back to normal is to track down the salamander cross that's been hidden away somewhere deep within Monsterland. To begin the daunting task of combing through every inch of your surroundings in search of a cure, much more than the new lizard man form is necessary. You'll gain access to other shapes as you locate and defeat other dragon bosses lying in wait. Each new self paves a way into a previously unreachable area, since they all have different strengths and abilities from one another. This goes well beyond drugging creatures and climbing inside of their skin to use them for your bidding like in Little Nemo the Dream Master for NES, but instead gives you permanent ways to interact with the environment. The forms themselves won't come as any surprise if you read the manual in advance, since they're prominently featured there alongside some lovely character art mirroring the beautiful in-game sprites that were endearingly animated. There was lots of attention to detail put into their designs, like the bobbing of Lion Man's tail when he walks, or how Hawkman hops around like birds actually do, and the cute defense stance where Lizard Man's tail acts as a shield when he's ducking. They even went so far as to keep the sword and shield in the same hands when the character changes walking direction. There's a bit of dazzle packed into every motion, and I loved it all. I did find transforming after a boss fight to be underwhelming, all things considered. There was very little fanfare given the biological implications, and other than a name change in the status menu, you're given absolutely no information about your new self. I don't usually appreciate hand-holding in times like these, but seeing that your only real moves are walking, jumping, and swinging a sword for the most part, it wasn't always immediately obvious what had changed in addition to your sprite. Lion Man in particular tripped me up at first, and it was eventually the instruction manual that saved the day. The blurb talks about his sword range running from his head to his paws, and along with the little visual cue where he turns his eyes downward when he swings was just the nudge that I needed. I finally realized that his ultimate fantastical power was being able to break blocks at his feet. His powers are kind of lame when you compare them to being able to, swim underwater, reach the corners of the sky above, or even defy gravity by scaling walls like the others. Poor Lion Man. The obvious drawback of a game like this is that the sense of discovery is going to be heightened in a first playthrough, with diminishing returns for each subsequent one, and this might decrease the replay value for some people. This sentiment can obviously be applied to any game that's exactly the same every time you play, but having those big revelations here is a big part of the formula that will never feel the same as it did the first time through. Thankfully, there are a lot of other things about Dragon's Trap to keep the interest burning, and the layered equipment system is one of them. Your base stats for attack and defense will differ depending on which physical form you take, and it should come as no surprise at all that using the many swords, shields, and armor will bolster those numbers further. What sets all this apart from other games from this time is that many pieces of gear have additional hidden effects to experiment with beyond how they change your stats. There are a couple of places in the manual that mention this and reveal that an item's name is supposed to give a hint about what else it can do. Even with that information in mind though, I didn't find any of these additional functions obvious by name alone, and I wonder if some of that might have been lost in translation. They're definitely worth looking into because there are a few things that will make parts of the game a lot easier, or even ease up the process of grinding for money. It's worth spending time to explore your options to get the most out of them. The pacing of the entire game is more or less controlled by equipment purchasing and the charm system. Charm stones are collected after winning fights or as a reward for exploring, and a certain amount of charm is needed to be able to buy things from shops. This was a neat way to bar someone from just grinding up a bunch of gold and scooping up the best equipment to tear ruthlessly through the countryside with. Instead, it forces players to walk through the path that the game intended. Because new stores with better equipment are always found in areas that you can't reach until you acquire a new physical form, progress is really on rails in a sense and is not as non-linear as you might think. Ignoring new upgrades and wandering into new territory unprepared will see you annihilated by harsher enemies. There's no leveling system here to help your cause either, and Dragon Trap's very good at letting you know that you've wandered somewhere that you shouldn't be yet, or that you're missing something important if you're getting killed left and right. It's important to stress that finding charm stones and purchasing the best equipment alone is not enough to guarantee valiant successes in combat. Fighting enemies in Dragon's Trap plays out through close contact melee encounters, and these are way too close for comfort sometimes. The attack range is extremely short here, and while there are lots of sub-weapons for ranged assault options, as a hanger-on to all consumable items, I rarely use them. The combat is not something that you can just run into with your sword swinging either, since enemies have a very long window of invincibility after being hit. If it took multiple hits to kill something, it could make these fights feel very long for what they were. This was the most annoying when I was running through an area for the 5th or 6th time and didn't feel like dealing with the long wait times in between strikes, but those iframes also benefited me when I got hit. Kinda. Taking on enemy projectiles or attacks and having a long invincibility window seems like it would be fantastic, but here you get frozen in place for a part of that recovery time. You might be avoiding more damage in the moment, but it doesn't give you room to retreat when things get really hairy. Everything goes to absolute hell when you're in a situation where you're heavily outnumbered by foes and projectiles. As soon as you come out of your invincibility state, you can get hit again right away and end up stun-locked in a horrible cycle that can quickly end your life. This was really bad in areas like the sunken ship where you can get surrounded and don't have a lot of headroom to escape. This was definitely one of the places that I had the hardest time pressing through, only coming second to the final palace. My trials there were extremely overshadowed though by the worst offenders, the dragon boss fights. These guys practically explode with a ton of projectiles and just drag you across the screen over and over again, slowly whittling your health down to nothing. There's not a thing you can do about it either, and this stun locking was definitely the most frustrating and unfair thing about combat. While moving through Monsterland, enemy placement couldn't have been any more heinous. Shadow men that pop up out of the ground were always guaranteed to interrupt some tricky jumps, and running into too many samurai or ninjas was almost always a trip straight to death's door. You not only needed to memorize where these guys were going to appear, but also how to fight each one. If you find yourself reaching for a pillow to scream into after being knocked back into the lava for the 100th time in the underground caves, you'll be heartened by the manual showcase of adorable monster art that adds even more luster to the in-game visual experience. Like the different protagonist forms, every depiction of the monsters you come up against just oozes with personality. They all have their own fun damage animations too, and as I slaughtered them, I couldn't get enough of master skeletons and their head shenanigans, or the whimsy of fairies or giant toads. It's hard to stay mad at faces like these. I spent a lot of time gushing about the visuals in Dragon Trap, but the auditory experience matches its awesomeness. I don't often have a lot of praise for Master System music since most of the tones aren't as varied as what you'd hear on other consoles of the day, but there's not a single song in this entire game that I don't like. Everything's catchy, especially the main theme, and much of the music from other areas has hints of that motif built into it that just made me want to keep playing. To avoid spoiling how everything comes together for the final stretch of the game, I'll just say that I was really impressed by how things were made to come full circle. Everything you learn right up until that point becomes integral to winning, and that kind of clever design in its implementation blew me away in one great final puzzle to tie it all off. I think it's also worth mentioning that I'm not sure that I would have beaten the game as quickly as I did without the help of one piece of equipment that's bugged in the Master System version. It makes you unkillable in the final showdown by repeatedly reviving you when you die. To my knowledge, it was removed from later releases of the game, but I'll take my tainted victory. I'm sure I could have gotten through it eventually without it, but that stun lock that I mentioned earlier is extremely bad in the final fight. I might not have had as good of an impression about the game if I'd been left to that final encounter's mercy indefinitely. Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap is easily one of my favorite games for the Sega Master System. It's a brilliant, action-packed quest that will keep your brain spinning furiously as you make your way through the colorful and immersive landscapes. While the struggle may rise up to seemingly impossible levels sometimes, the compulsion to see what comes next or how to crack the different puzzles will stoke the fires of perseverance and keep you hooked. If you're someone that likes adorable protagonists fighting to the death with equally adorable enemies, then The Dragon's Trap is one worth getting snared by.